They posted the photo at 11:47 p.m. Best night ever, my husband's caption read. Raina was beside him in the frame, her hand resting at the edge of his sleeve in the way hands rest when they are accustomed to being there. I was not in the photo. I was not supposed to know what the caption said, because I was not supposed to understand the language it was written in. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 58 years old. For 26 years, I have restored broken buildings, pulled crumbling hotels back from demolition, replaced rotted beams, repointed cracked stone, and returned rooms to what they had once been before neglect and time and other people's carelessness had taken them apart. I know how to read a structure. I know which damage is cosmetic and which runs all the way to the foundation. I did not see the damage in my own marriage until I heard my husband discuss the timeline for having me declared legally incompetent, in Japanese, over salmon and steak, 30 floors above Seattle, while I sat across the table pretending to be confused. By the end of that evening, there were 63 things Blake Mercer believed were true about me. Not one of them was accurate. And a blue leather briefcase sitting open on a drafting table was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Welcome to this channel, where we tell the stories of women who were written off and wrote back. If you have ever been the person who carried the weight, built the thing, and then watched someone move into the space you created and begin deciding your future for you, settle in. Drop a comment when this story reaches you, and subscribe, because what Evelyn heard at that dinner table is only the beginning of what she did with it. Let me go back to where this started, because the ending only makes sense if you understand who she was before Blake needed her to be someone else. Evelyn grew up in a working-class family in Portland, the daughter of a woman who refinished furniture in the garage on weekends to help make rent. From the time she was small, she understood that beautiful things could be rebuilt. That understanding became a philosophy, then a career, then a company. She spent 9 years in Kyoto studying traditional restoration before she opened her first hotel. A weather-beaten coastal inn with leaking windows and a porch tilted toward the sea. She bought it because she could see what it had once been. That was her gift and her discipline, the ability to look past present damage and recognize original worth. She believed, for most of her life, that if she did good work and stayed steady and refused to make herself the loudest voice in any room, the truth would eventually sort itself out. It was an admirable belief. It was also the belief that made her exploitable. Blake Mercer entered her life when she was lonely enough to mistake attention for understanding. Her first husband had died when her daughter Claire was 21. For years after, grief had made Evelyn efficient and emotionally unavailable. She built hotels because buildings responded to effort in ways people did not. A cracked foundation could be repaired. A damaged roof could be replaced. Grief offered no drawings and no final inspection. Blake offered warmth, presence, and a calm certainty that she deserved to rest. He believed, with the settled conviction of a man who had never once been challenged on it, that standing close to someone's success was the same as building it. That proximity was a form of ownership. That 6 years beside Evelyn's work entitled him to the work itself. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything. But he learned her vulnerabilities carefully, and he used them. Claire, Evelyn's daughter, had grown distant over the years, complicated by the company, by Blake's quiet suggestions, by the ordinary tensions that accumulate between a driven mother and a daughter who needed more than blueprints. Blake used those tensions like a contractor uses existing cracks. He did not create the damage. He simply widened it, until Claire believed Evelyn had pushed her away, and Evelyn believed Claire had grown resentful and stopped calling. The company Evelyn had built over 26 years was called Harbor and Pine. 9 hotels, each one a restoration project. The kind of properties that took years and required a particular kind of patience, an ability to see through present ruin to what had once been standing. Blake managed daily operations. He knew the occupancy reports and the renovation budgets. He knew the language of the business well enough to sound fluent. But he had never understood its structure. He had never asked why the properties were held the way they were. He assumed that standing close to the engine was the same as owning it. It was not. And that assumption would cost him everything. The medications began gradually. Evelyn started forgetting appointments she had kept for years. She woke with headaches so severe that light seemed to scrape against her eyes. She stumbled on stairs she had climbed for a decade. Blake was always there afterward, patient, concerned, ready with another pill, another glass of water, another quiet reminder that she was getting older. He managed her calendar, which meant he controlled which appointments she missed. He explained her absences and her confusion to colleagues, to board members, to anyone who might otherwise ask a direct question. Once a person stops trusting her own memory, she begins borrowing someone else's version of reality. Blake made sure his was the only version available. The night of the dinner, Evelyn had been losing pieces of herself for months, but something about a private dining room 30 floors above Seattle, the black ceramic plates, the servers who moved like they had come from the walls, Blake's careful performance of concern in front of the Tokyo investor seated across from them. Something about all of it was clarifying rather than dulling. Blake had brought Reina Kuroda to dinner under the explanation that she might help expand Harbor and Pine. What he had not said was that she had already been inside the company, inside the marriage, and inside a plan to strip everything Evelyn had built and sell it before anyone thought to ask her permission. Evelyn has had some difficult days lately, Blake told Reina in English. His voice soft and patient and designed for an audience. Memory lapses. Nothing serious, we hope. I try not to overwhelm her with business. Evelyn looked down at her plate and counted 3 breaths. I still understand my own company, she said. Blake placed his hand over hers. To anyone watching, it looked affectionate. His fingers tightened just enough to warn her. Of course you do. I only mean you deserve to rest. Reina offered a polished smile. Your properties are admired in Japan, Mrs. Mercer. The restoration work at the Briar House is especially beautiful. Thank you, Evelyn said. I spent 9 years in Kyoto studying traditional restoration before I opened my first hotel. Blake laughed lightly. That was a lifetime ago. She remembers Kyoto more clearly than she remembers yesterday. Then, Reina switched to Japanese. Blake knew Evelyn had lived in Japan, but he believed she had worked only with American designers and translators. Early in the marriage, she had ordered dinner in Japanese once, and he had laughed, called her accent charming. She had let him believe that was the extent of it. The truth was that she had negotiated leases in Osaka, argued construction terms in Nagoya, and spent enough nights in Kyoto boardrooms to understand not only the language, but what people meant when they softened a threat with a smile. Does she always talk about the past when she gets nervous? Reina asked. Blake answered in the same language, his pronunciation clumsy but understandable. She talks about whatever makes her feel important. Evelyn allowed her eyes to drift toward the rain on the window, pretending to be distracted. How long until the evaluation? Reina asked. Bell submits his report next week, Blake replied. He says the symptoms are progressing exactly as expected. And the medication? I increased it 4 days ago. She forgot the housekeeper's name yesterday. Reina laughed softly. You told me she called her by the dog's name. She did. They both looked at Evelyn. She picked up her water glass and intentionally missed on the first attempt. Blake reached over and guided her hand, performing patience while his thumb pressed hard against her wrist. 2 more public incidents should be enough, he said, returning to Japanese. Once the court gives me emergency authority, I can approve the sale. Then Reina leaned across the table. It is strange. A woman can build an empire and still end up sitting quietly while other people divide it. And Blake smiled. Soon she won't know what she owned. If someone in your life treated your silence like permission. If they performed love in public and revealed contempt the moment they believed you could not follow, comment below. Comment if you have spent years being everyone's answer and nobody's question. Subscribe, because what Evelyn did when she got home that night is the reason this story exists. Evelyn let her spoon slip from her fingers. It struck the plate with a sharp crack. Blake turned immediately, solicitous and ready. She blinked at him with the soft confusion he had been carefully teaching her to perform for months. She looked at Reina and gave her a weak, embarrassed smile. Forgive me, I seem to be tired tonight. When Blake looked away, Reina leaned forward and whispered in Japanese, "Enjoy these dinners while you can. Soon you will be eating from a tray in a locked room." Evelyn held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she let her eyes lose focus. What Reina saw was an aging woman disappearing inside herself. What Reina did not see was the young architect who had once stood in a freezing Kyoto warehouse while 3 contractors tried to hide structural damage behind polite language. She had learned then that people reveal their true plans when they believe the least important person in the room cannot understand them. In the elevator going down, Blake leaned close to Evelyn's ear and spoke in Japanese one final time. "A few more weeks, Evelyn, then you won't be my problem anymore." She turned toward him slowly and gave him the confused smile he expected. "Did you say something?" Relief crossed his face like weather clearing. "Nothing important." He guided her into the elevator, never understanding that those 2 words had just become the greatest mistake of his life. That night, in the old design room Blake considered a useless museum of an earlier version of her, Evelyn opened a tall lacquered cabinet she had bought from a craftsman outside Kyoto. Behind the lowest drawer was a narrow compartment no one else knew existed. Inside lay a secure phone her attorney Marisol Vega had insisted she keep years earlier after a contractor made threats. She dialed a number from memory. Marisol answered on the 4th ring. When Evelyn identified herself, the warmth in Marisol's voice was replaced immediately by the precise focus that had once terrified opposing counsel. "Do not confront him," Marisol said. "Do not sign anything. Do not eat or swallow anything you cannot account for yourself." Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Blake was approaching. "Find Nolan Price and Daniel Cho," Evelyn whispered. "Find out what my husband has been putting in my body and how much of my company he has already stolen." She ended the call, slid the phone behind the drawer, and opened her notebook just as Blake entered, carrying a glass of water and 3 pale capsules in his palm. She placed them beneath her tongue, swallowed without letting them pass, and removed them after he kissed her forehead and left the room. She wrapped them in tissue and locked them inside the compartment. The discipline required for that moment, that small, precise, deliberate act, was harder than anything the Breyer House restoration had ever asked of her. A white van marked Northwest Environmental Services arrived the next morning. The man at the door introduced himself as Nolan Price, licensed environmental consultant. Blake let him inside because Nolan looked ordinary. Wealth makes some people careless around anyone wearing work boots. They assume the person carrying a tool has no power, when the people who understand a building's hidden systems often know far more than those who own the view from the top floor. While Nolan documented the shared spaces under Evelyn's legal authorization, Daniel Cho worked separately through company records she controlled as founder. Within 2 days, he had traced nearly $1.8 million from restoration budgets into 4 vendors with no employees, no equipment, and mailing addresses linked to Reina's investment firm. The money had been divided into consulting fees, emergency repair invoices, and deposits for work that never began. Theft inside a company rarely looks like a masked stranger carrying cash through a broken window. It looks like paperwork approved by someone trusted enough that nobody reads the second page. The laboratory results arrived the following morning. The capsules did not contain memory supplements. They contained substances capable of causing sedation, poor balance, confusion, and short-term memory disruption, in amounts inconsistent enough that the effects could appear unpredictable and hard to trace. Evelyn thought of mornings when words had disappeared in the middle of sentences. She thought of the night she woke on the bathroom floor while Blake held her face and told her she had wandered there confused. She had thanked him for finding her. That memory hurt in a way the affair did not. There was a particular horror in learning that the person causing your fear was also the person receiving gratitude for rescuing you from it. She sat in the dark that night, with a receiver hidden beneath a folded blanket, listening while Blake spoke to Reina through the study phone. "Bell says the petition needs stronger public evidence." "He'll have it," Blake replied. "The preservation gala is Friday. Half the board will see her lose control. And the dosage? She's taking everything I give her. Once the judge grants emergency authority, I control the voting trust, the accounts, and the sale." Reina laughed softly. "By the end of the month, Harbor and Pine belongs to us." They had named their plan Project Grey Harbor, after fog, because they believed her mind had disappeared inside it. They did not understand that the fog was already lifting. The night before the gala, Evelyn spread the ownership maps of Harbor and Pine across the drafting table. Blake had managed the business long enough to become arrogant, but not long enough to understand its bones. He believed he was preparing to buy a house. He did not know she could remove the foundation before he reached the front door. Harbor and Pine operations managed the hotels, paid the staff, handled daily expenses. But it did not own the buildings. It did not own the brand, the art, the restoration rights, or the architectural archives. Those sat in separate holding companies, in a preservation foundation, in licensing entities, all under the Cedar Legacy Trust Evelyn had created 12 years earlier after a developer tried to force a sale. Blake had called it unnecessary paperwork at the time. People often dismiss precautions when they secretly believe they will be the ones benefiting from your vulnerability. There was one more piece. A Japanese travel company called Kasumi had approached Evelyn nearly a year earlier about a 7-year heritage tourism partnership projected to generate $132 million across the Harbor and Pine properties. The agreement was genuine and detailed, and it contained a change of control clause. If Harbor and Pine operations changed ownership without Kasumi's written approval, the agreement terminated automatically. The brand, programming, and property access remained under entities Blake did not control. Evelyn placed a copy of the Kasumi memorandum inside a dark blue leather briefcase. Nothing was altered. The change of control clause appeared deep in the document, past the cover page, past the projected revenue, past the hotel list bearing the Kasumi seal. Any competent buyer would have found it. Any responsible attorney would have demanded time to verify it. Greed does not merely make people want more. It changes what they are willing to notice. Once someone sees the number they hope to see, every warning beneath it begins to look like an inconvenience. At the gala, Evelyn performed her decline with the same precision she had once used to restore the Breyer House's original ceiling mural, careful, patient, methodical, and invisible to anyone watching too quickly. She called Arthur Pembroke by his dead brother's name. She asked a server where the ladies' room was, though she had designed the corridor leading to it. She wandered toward the service entrance and let Blake redirect her in front of 3 board members. During her speech, she cited the wrong founding date, repeated a sentence, and called the Harbor Preservation Foundation by the wrong name. She told a room full of people that Claire should be here by now, then said Claire was 17. She watched board members look away from her and toward Blake. Humiliation is not only the pain of appearing weak. It is the pain of knowing you could correct everyone and choosing not to. Because the truth would arrive too early. Raina arrived in silver. Blake introduced her as Harbor and Pine's future strategic partner, then described the gala speech as another episode while his hand remained at Raina's waist a moment longer than business required. Later, crouching beside Evelyn's chair while Blake was across the room, Raina whispered in Japanese that she expected the collapse to be more dramatic. She looked at the Breyer House's restored ballroom and said the land was worth more without the building. There are people who cannot recognize value unless they can convert it into cash. And because they cannot understand devotion, they assume devotion is weakness. The following morning, Evelyn drove home with the blue briefcase resting openly on the passenger seat, the Kasumi seal and the figure 132 million visible through the gap. She left the design room door partly open. She asked Blake twice what day it was. It was Thursday, and she called it Wednesday both times. He recorded her confusion on his phone. He waited 43 minutes before entering the design room. He opened the memorandum and photographed the cover page, the revenue projection, and the hotel list. He skimmed the financial summaries. He stopped before the legal schedules. He never reached the change of control clause. Less than a minute later, he called Raina. "Tell me this is real. 132 million over 7 years," he whispered. "If Kasumi signs, the company's value triples, which is why we close before the agreement becomes public. I can raise 29 million, Raina said. I'll liquidate the investment account and use the Tokyo apartments as collateral. Do it. There can be no mistake, Blake. My family's property will be tied to this." He laughed softly. There won't be. Evelyn can barely remember what day it is. Evelyn sat in the chair upstairs, listening to her husband risk Raina's family's collateral on a document he had not finished reading, and felt anger rise through her with such force that she almost stood. She remained in the chair. Anger offers a few seconds of relief. Patience allows consequences to mature. Midnight, rain hard against the Briar House windows. Evelyn stood in the original service corridor beneath the hotel, built in 1911 so staff could move unseen, discovered during restoration behind a wall previous owners had covered with cheap paneling. Blake had never been interested in places that did not impress people. That was one reason he had never understood the company. Marisol waited in the records room with Daniel Cho and two independent trustees. The table was covered with deeds, licensing agreements, property maps, and transfer resolutions. No champagne. No music. Real power rarely announces itself with a ceremony. She signed the trademark rights for Harbor and Pine into the Cedar Legacy Trust. She signed voting control of the 8 real estate holding companies. She transferred the reservation platform, the customer database, the architectural archives, the restoration designs, the art collection, the carved panels, antique furniture, and stained glass that gave each hotel its identity, belonging not to operations but to the Mercer Preservation Foundation. On loan while the hotels were managed to its standards. The operating company Blake was buying would have no land beneath it, no name above its doors, and no future beyond $31 million in disclosed obligations he was too greedy to read. She signed the final document just before 2 in the morning. Her hand was completely still. For months, Blake had made her afraid of her own fingers. He had watched every dropped spoon, every shaking glass, every time she reached for a railing, cataloging her fragility as evidence. Now, the pen moved across the paper with the same certainty it had when she purchased her first hotel. She had not lost herself. She had simply been buried beneath chemicals and fear and someone else's version of her. Marisol placed one final document in front of her. The successor trustee if anything happened to Evelyn. Claire Mercer. Evelyn stared at her daughter's name. She had not spoken to Claire in months. Not truly. Blake had used their existing distance to build a wall between them. Sending messages from Evelyn's accounts, intercepting Claire's letters, delivering each lie wrapped in a small piece of truth. Claire had written, "I don't want the hotels, Mom. I just want my mother back." Blake had intercepted that letter. Money can be traced. Property can be recovered. A false medical record can be challenged. But time stolen between two people has no account number, and no court can order it returned. Make Claire the successor, Evelyn said. Not because she is my daughter. Because she was the only person who kept trying to reach me when everyone else accepted Blake's story. The Briar House the following evening. 200 candles, white orchids in crystal vases. A string quartet beneath the ceiling mural Evelyn had fought 6 months to save from demolition. Blake had arranged every detail to look dignified and loving. That was the strange thing about betrayal at its most calculated. It rarely wanted to appear ugly. It wanted witnesses to remember polished glass and a devoted husband doing what had to be done. He arrived with Evelyn in a wheelchair, the belt fastened across her lap, her hands folded beneath a wool blanket. The bruise on her wrist where he had forced her to sign the authorization papers had darkened to purple. He did not look at it. People who cause pain often become remarkably blind to the evidence once they believe the victim has accepted the explanation. Raina stood near the signing table in red silk, holding a champagne flute as though the hotel already belonged to her. 2 attorneys, an escrow officer, 3 board members, a photographer hired to document what Blake called a historic transition. What neither of them knew, Marisol was watching from a room beyond the ballroom. State investigators were positioned inside the hotel. 2 members of the serving staff were not servers. "Is this Claire's wedding?" Evelyn asked when Raina approached. Blake gave a soft, pained laugh. "No, sweetheart, we're finishing some business." Raina bent close and whispered in Japanese, "This is better than a wedding. Tonight we inherit a kingdom without waiting for the queen to die." Blake addressed the room. He was assuming control because Evelyn's health no longer permitted her to manage the company responsibly. The agreement would protect her legacy. He said it with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it until it sounded like truth. The escrow officer began reading the closing summary. 29 million in escrow. Kuroda Urban Partners waiving extended due diligence. The buyer accepting all disclosed debt, contractual obligations, severance guarantees, guest refund liabilities, maintenance commitments, and change of control provisions. Reina's lead attorney shifted uneasily. Miss Kuroda, I need to confirm once more that you wish to proceed without the additional review period. She did not look at him. We have reviewed the essential documents. She had reviewed the photographs Blake stole from Evelyn's briefcase. She had seen 132 million and allowed that number to answer every question she had not asked. Blake signed first. Quick and confident. He did not pause over the disclosure schedules. He did not ask why each property appeared under a separate management agreement rather than as an owned asset. He did not notice that the Harbor and Pine brand license terminated automatically at midnight. The escrow officer then placed a tablet across Evelyn's knees and explained that the bank required a recorded acknowledgement from the original majority owner regardless of who had signed on her behalf. Blake crouched beside her. Yes, just like we discussed. One touch. She looked at him with gentle confusion. He closed his fingers around her bruised wrist and pressed her thumb to the screen. A green checkmark appeared with a timestamp and the recorded image of his hand controlling hers. The funds have been released, the officer announced. Transfer of Harbor and Pine Operations LLC is complete. Champagne corks burst across the ballroom. The quartet began a bright, triumphant piece. Blake rose and kissed Reina openly beneath the cedar and compass emblem Evelyn had designed when she was 31, before she owned anything except one failing coastal inn, and a debt large enough to keep her awake for years. The photographer captured it. Blake stepped behind the wheelchair. He leaned close to Evelyn's ear. Tomorrow, you'll wake up in a room without a view. Reina and I will wake up owning everything you built. She felt his breath against her skin and remembered every morning he had handed her pills. Every message from Claire he had hidden. Every stumble he had watched with secret satisfaction. Take her out, he told the attendants. One of them reached for the wheelchair handles. Evelyn placed her hands against the wheels and locked them. She unfastened the belt and let it fall across the seat. She removed the blanket from her knees, placed both feet on the marble floor, and stood without assistance. No shaking, no confusion, no weakness. Blake's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered beside his shoe. Reina's face lost every trace of color. Evelyn smoothed the front of her ivory jacket, adjusted her cuffs, and looked from her husband to the woman who believed she had purchased her life. Then, she spoke in the same fluent Japanese she had once used in Kyoto boardrooms. $29 million for a company carrying $31 million in disclosed debt and contractual obligations. You should have read the attachments. The ballroom went completely still. The quartet had stopped mid-phrase, leaving one violin note trembling in the air before it disappeared. How much did you understand? Reina whispered in Japanese. The dinner, Evelyn said. The calls. The guardianship petition. The jokes about the locked room. Every word. Blake stepped toward her. Evelyn, this is part of the illness. You're confused, am I? She said in English. Because I seem to remember you telling Reina that 2 more public incidents would be enough for Dr. Bell's report. A murmur moved through the room. You all saw her at the gala, Blake said. You saw what happened. Yes, she replied. They saw exactly what I needed them to see. The lights dimmed. A projection screen descended over the restored mural. Blake's recorded voice filled the ballroom. She's getting worse. Bell says the board will accept emergency control after Friday, then Reina's. Once the judge signs, we move the company before anyone questions the valuation. Those recordings were obtained illegally, Blake said. Marisol entered through the side doors with Nolan Price and 2 state investigators. The recordings were preserved from shared spaces Mrs. Mercer owns and from company systems she was legally authorized to audit. Your attorneys may challenge their admissibility later. Tonight, the investigators are interested in the conduct they document. The screen changed to the breakfast room footage. Blake's hand wrapped around Evelyn's bruised wrist, forcing the pen across the authorization forms. His voice sounded colder through the ballroom speakers than it had in the room. I gave you 6 years of my life. The least you can do is leave me something worth having. Someone near the back gasped. People often imagine abuse as something unmistakable, dramatic, impossible to miss. The most successful kind survives because it learns to resemble exhaustion, concern, and private family difficulty. Blake had not needed everyone to believe him completely. He had only needed them to prefer his explanation over the discomfort of questioning it. Daniel Cho stepped beside the screen as financial records appeared. $1.8 million traced from renovation budgets into 4 vendors with no employees, no equipment, and addresses linked to Raina's investment network. Each payment was approved under Mr. Mercer's credentials and routed through entities connected to Kuroda Urban Partners. Raina turned toward Blake. You told me those invoices were clean. You chose the vendors. You controlled the accounts. Their alliance collapsed in real time. Partnerships built on greed are often strong only while the reward remains visible. The moment loss appears, loyalty becomes evidence everyone wants to assign elsewhere. The next images showed communications between Blake and Dr. Thomas Bell, instructions to emphasize disorientation, to increase notation of safety risk. Alongside records of consulting payments from a Kuroda-linked account to a company owned by Bell's brother. One of the investigators touched his earpiece and nodded to Marisol. Bell had been detained. Raina slammed her glass onto the signing table. Reverse the transaction. Her lead attorney turned rapidly through the closing binder. The funds have already been released. The liabilities were disclosed. The property ownership was disclosed. The brand license termination and Kasumi change of control clause were disclosed. You signed the due diligence waiver after I advised against it. Evelyn stepped toward the table. You did not purchase the hotels. You purchased Harbor and Pine Operations, LLC. Daniel placed the ownership chart on the screen. The Cedar Legacy Trust at the top. Beneath it, the real estate companies, the trademark, the reservation platform, the art collection, the restoration archives, the Kasumi negotiations. The operating company beside them, connected only through agreements that ended when ownership changed. The company you bought manages staff and guest operations. It does not own the buildings, the brand, or the Kasumi proposal. What it does carry is $31 million in disclosed debt and contractual obligations. Raina found the relevant schedules. Her hands began to shake. The investigators moved forward. Blake and Raina were being detained on suspicion of financial exploitation, fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. Additional charges pending evidence review. One board member began crying. The other asked for an attorney. Financial records showed bonuses promised to both men after the sale. They had not supported Blake because they believed Evelyn was ill. They had chosen to believe she was ill because that belief had become profitable. Blake moved toward Evelyn. You ruined me. Hotel security intercepted him before he reached her. This company was mine too, he said. I built it with you. No, she said. You stood beside what I built and waited for me to become weak enough to take it. That is not the same thing. As the investigators restrained him, his expression shifted. The fury disappeared, replaced by the familiar wounded softness he had always used when he needed forgiveness. Even then, he wanted her to explain him kindly. Evelyn, tell them this got out of control. Some people betray you while assuming your love will remain available afterward, waiting like a spare key they can use when consequences arrive. It did not get out of control, she said. It reached exactly the ending you designed. Red and blue lights moved across the rain-dark windows. The ballroom held orchids and broken glass and the remains of a celebration that had lasted less than 5 minutes. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were completely still. 3 months later, she stood on the balcony of her smallest coastal hotel and watched the Pacific push gray waves against the rocks below. Claire arrived just after noon, carrying a cardboard box filled with the pieces of their relationship Blake had hidden from both of them. Intercepted letters, messages sent from Evelyn's accounts, birthday cards returned without opening. I thought you hated me, Claire said. I thought you had stopped trying. They sat by a fire overlooking the ocean while Claire spread the evidence of 2 years of carefully managed separation across the table between them. Blake had not invented the distance between them. He had fed the fears that already existed, Claire's fear that the company always came first. Evelyn's fear that her daughter resented what she had built, and grown them until they became walls. "I should have shown up anyway," Claire said. "And I should have asked why your silence sounded nothing like you." Real reconciliation is not a door that swings open. It is a damaged staircase rebuilt one step at a time, both people testing each board before placing their full weight on it. The guardianship petition was dismissed. Dr. Bell lost his medical license and faced criminal charges. Raina's investors froze her accounts after learning family properties had been put up as collateral. Blake was denied bail. The 2 board members who accepted payments resigned. The Cedar Legacy Trust assumed permanent control of the hotels, and Evelyn gave employees a share of future profits. None of it felt as satisfying as people expected. Justice provides consequences, but it does not make betrayal small. It simply prevents the person who harmed you from continuing to write the ending. Claire agreed to become the trust's chief preservation architect. She refused, however, to be named sole successor immediately. "I don't want to inherit a repaired relationship," she said. "I want to help repair it." 6 months after the Briar House, they traveled to Kyoto together. Evelyn took her to the narrow wooden townhouse where she had completed her first restoration project, standing between newer concrete buildings, smaller than memory had made it, but still upright. Its cedar lattice glowed in the afternoon light. Claire ran her fingers over a beam Evelyn had repaired when she was 29. "You never told me you spoke Japanese this well," she said. "I thought that part of my life was finished," Evelyn replied. "Then Blake reminded me that nothing we truly learn disappears just because someone underestimates us." They stood in the courtyard while rain tapped against the roof tiles. For months, her husband had believed age had made her weak, silence had made her ignorant, and love had made her controllable. He was wrong about all 3. Age had taught her patience. Silence had allowed her to hear the truth. And love, once separated from fear, had finally brought her daughter back. A beam repaired at 29 still carries the weight. A building restored survives longer than the ones that were never damaged. Because someone had to learn every hidden weakness in order to fix it. If tonight this story reached you, if you have ever let someone mistake your silence for absence, your stillness for surrender, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment with the moment you decided to stop explaining yourself and start building the evidence. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.